Hi, I'm Dan Welch with Emerging Civil War, one of the Symposium co-hosts and co-chairs, if you will. And I'm standing here with Mark Maloy, who did a virtual presentation for us today on Fort Sumter. Mark, what got you interested in the story of Fort Sumter? You know, when we think about the American Civil War and early battles, we think about First Manassas, July 1861. What drew you to the earlier part of the story in April of 1861?
I think what really drew me was having lived in Charleston. When I was in college at William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, growing up in Virginia, I've been focused so much on these battles, on the battlefields here in Virginia. But taking a trip one time to Charleston, I fell in love with the city. Me and my wife moved down there for a few years, and when there, I started working at Fort Sumter National Monument, which is now Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie National Historical Park. And I just found the story to be fascinating. The amount of characters that were involved, the personalities. All these guys go off and end up, having, roles later on in the war. But it's often, like you said, I feel like overlooked. So I thought being able to tell that story that we told at the site there, virtually here today, would be wonderful.
You know, if you haven't watched Mark's virtual presentation yet, I highly encourage you to do so. And he was just talking about characters, and he really, in his presentation, talked a lot about a number of characters. Robert Anderson in command of the U.S. forces at the fort. Some of the more interesting, colorful Confederate characters, like the senator from Texas, Lewis Wigfall, you talked about. Edmund Ruffin, you talked about. I'm not going to give their stories away because you're going to want to watch Mark's presentation. But a story that I've always kind of found fascinating and hope you can expand upon is about Abner Doubleday. You took care of the mythology surrounding his association with baseball, and we're happy that the MLB's back even for a shortened season this year. But talk about, there was a time where Abner Doubleday, one of his duties was to leave the fort, go into Charleston and get the mail, but he had to stop doing that all of a sudden. What happened down there?
Yeah, so, Anderson and most of the officers there at Fort Moultrie originally, and then later Fort Sumter, they weren't abolitionists. They weren't, supporters of the Republican Party. We're not looking for civil war to break out in Charleston Harbor, with the exception of Abner Doubleday, who was an outspoken abolitionist and a Republican, supporter of President Lincoln. The locals in Charleston really didn't like that. Even threatened to tar and feather Abner Doubleday. And he really gets a lot of scrutiny through the newspapers, and he's kind of singled out as this Republican, and that's why South Carolina seceded, because the Republican Abraham Lincoln's elected in November of 1860, so they secede, and Abner Doubleday came to sort of symbolize that in Charleston Harbor.
Now, when you watch Mark's presentation, you're going to want to stay tuned all the way through the end. He kind of talks a little bit about how Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie and Charleston has changed over time as a historical landscape and what it looks like today and how would you go about visiting. But one of the things that Mark also did at the end of his presentation is kind of give you some ideas for further reading, because it really is a forgotten moment, we consider in the Eastern Theater, if you will, in April of 1861. So Mark has suggested some really good secondary histories of the actions at Fort Sumter in the spring of 1861. But what about some primary source materials? What are some good first-hand accounts that folks can read about of the events that happened in and around Charleston?
One great one is, as we were just talking about, Abner Doubleday. He writes memoirs of what it was like and what happened while he was there. So that's definitely a good one to get kind of a civilian perspective. Mary Boykin Chestnut kept a diary that's, because she was there during all those moments, and her husband was involved in the negotiations, so she kind of gives a good civilian perspective. From the Confederate perspective, Edmund Ruffin, who you mentioned earlier, he has a meticulous diary that he writes down really detailed notes of everything that happened down there, so I definitely recommend. I think with those three primary sources, you kind of get a good view from each different side at that time.
One of the things Mark mentioned too in the end of his talks, he was talking about some of those readings, is part of the Emerging Civil War series of books coming out in the next year is former historian, National Park Service historian down at Fort Sumter, Rick Hatcher's book is going to be coming out on the actions of 1861 in the spring of 1861 at Fort Sumter.
Yeah, he was the historian when I worked there back in 2009, 2010. I'm really glad that he's writing this book that, hopefully it'll come out next year. And I think it's called Thunder in the Harbor, and it looks like it'll be great as far as giving you a brief overview of all these items and then showing you where some of those sites are. You can still see, because there's all sorts of stuff in that Charleston area to explore, other than just Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie, so there's plenty of historic sites.
Well, make sure you check out Mark Maloy's presentation on Fort Sumter as part of our Emerging Civil War virtual symposium this year. Mark is a good friend of Emerging Civil War over at Emerging Revolutionary War, and an excellent Revolutionary War historian as well. So,
And that's also something, not to cut you off, but the history of Charleston goes even back to the Revolutionary War. And that's something I'm working on too, is an emerging Revolutionary War book to cover the siege of Charleston in 1780 and the battle that happened there in 1776, and kind of show you some of the historical sites associated with the Revolution there too. So just want to throw a plug out there that
Absolutely.
we don't forget the Revolutionary War history too.
Yeah,
So.
and make sure, as Mark's saying, there's a lot of great sources and articles and blog posts on the Emerging Revolutionary War blog. Make sure you check it out. They've been having a wonderful series of Sunday night program, Facebook Lives. Make sure you're checking those out as well. Pick up several of the Emerging Revolutionary War book series. So we really want to thank Mark Maloy for joining us this year as part of the ECW Virtual Symposium, and we hope to see you again in a little while as we continue our virtual symposium.